All right, welcome back. We have our viewers online who are hopefully rejoining us. After I said no bullet points, everything went blank. People left in droves. You decided to come back hoping that there's hope for you and for me. All right. So, thinking about bullet points, again, try to use 2 or 3 points. Again, for every rule that we might come up with for graphics, there may be an exception. All right? Exceptions are meant to be used exceptionally, which means, which is another way of saying rarely. All right? So a third font could be used for subpoints. A third thing that I did, okay, there are several things that I've done, again, to avoid subpoints. So different colors, different font faces, and also indent. So the things that are on a particular level, indent. It does exactly the same thing that a bullet point does. And in fact, if you notice, most bullet points are indented anyway. So I'm using an outline as part to demonstrate how to create a slide if you are going to create a slide with more than one idea on it. If you're in a classroom, certain situations, if you're preaching a sermon, although less, I would say, if you're teaching in a classroom, there may be situations where you really do need to use outlines and recreate an outline in some way on your slides. So, in general, subpoints should be smaller and just a little bit lighter. Again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to give visual clues that are easy to spot to help your students follow. So again, since we read English speakers read top to bottom, left to right, then our indents obviously move to the right, reading top to bottom. As we're getting a little bit smaller as we go down, we're eliminating the need for bullet points. Use no more, this is my recommendation, I would suggest using no more than 2 outline levels on any point. One of the problems that I see that makes it difficult, in my estimation, for students to follow things is when you keep adding subpoints further and further in and further down until you end up 6 levels deep and nobody can follow where you are in the whole thing. And so my recommendation is that you try to go no more than 2 outline levels on a given slide. If you're going to go more than 2 outline levels deep, I would suggest starting a new slide and starting over at that new level and then going on from there. It will make it much easier for your students to follow. Bullets are not necessary. Different fonts and or colors suffice. And also, ladies and gentlemen, I know it's been a long time since high school for some of us. For some of us, longer than others, and I'm not going to try to even guess what the difference might be. Even though they don't teach it anymore, there was a day when they taught rules of outlining. Remember that? They don't teach that anymore. I can tell you because I teach students from the current generation, and they have no idea how to outline. All right? Let me check to see.
What's an outline?
Yeah, what's an outline? Good question. me see if I've got this on here. All right. Rules of outlining. If we had a board here and a marker, I would show you what not to do. All right? Now, one of the common mistakes that you will see people doing in outlines today, including pastors who should know better, as well as Bible teachers who should know better, is that if the really basic rules, if you have 1 point at any given level, you have to have at least 2. That's the basic rule right there. If you have any point at any given level, you have to have at least 2, or you combine them into 1. So what you should not have is, let's just assume I'm using letters here. This should not be 1, and then under it be A, and then under it 2, and under it an A, and under it 3, and under it, okay? Now, the outline levels do not have to be parallel. In other words, you can have, if you have 2 outline levels at this level, you can have as many outline levels under here as you want. That's not a problem. But if you have 1, you have to have 2. If you're only going to have this one and you're going to start another one here, then this needs to be combined with that one into a single point. That's the basic rules of outlining. For some reason, they don't seem to teach this anymore, and it's a very common mistake, and I'm assuming, given the color of the hair or lack thereof in this room, that you all know these points. So bullets aren't necessary. Different colors and or different fonts and or colors suffice, and remember the rules of outlining. Another thing that is helpful when you're using different types of fonts is to alternate the fonts that you're using at each level. So for example, if the title font is serif, then think about using a sans serif font for one of your main points. Again, it helps your eyes separate. It also helps to use a different color. Again, you're trying to just help your audience follow what you're doing. Try to balance the font faces and sizes. Now, what does that mean? The title font can be just about as bold as you want it to be, and it still fit and look decent. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to create a situation where you have chosen to make your fonts this size just to get all of your points onto one slide. It might be good for the teenager sitting on the front row. It will not be so great for the person who's a little older sitting on the back row. So try to use balance.
What's the rule of thumb for the font size in a room in an auditorium?
That is a great question. That particular font size right there is 36 points. The one underneath it is 32. From where you're standing, is that fairly readable from where you're standing? So, and you may actually have to test it. That's a great question. You may have to test it. I have found very few situations, unless you're in a very small room, where if you get 18 or under, then you're in trouble. Generally 24 is about as small as you would want to go in any size room in my estimation. Subpoints can be less bold and try to stay with 2 or 3 colors for the text. So this text, it's actually the same color as the color of the title text. So again, you're minimizing the number of fonts you use, you're minimizing the number of colors that you're using, and you're minimizing the difference in size between the points. It's a little less bold, but it's not significantly less bold. What would look odd would be, definitely you don't want to do this. You don't want your subpoints bigger. And you don't want them to be a lot smaller. You're looking for balance. You're looking for things that are easy to read.
A question for you, Dave, and this, if we can, in this area. Some churches you go to, you have the screens that are way up above the baptistry.
Okay.
Very rarely do you have them where they're down where people can read them. So, and then sometimes you get smaller screens that are way up.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, how do you combat the different size screens and different locations as far as font goes and something? I mean, is there any?
We're working through that right now at our home church. We're trying to decide. Our church is not a legalistic church by any means, but we still use hymnals and have an organ and a piano.
Amen.
We have a projector that we use on occasion, but we don't have televisions, although we're planning on putting TVs up. And so we're discussing that whole thing right now. What we're planning on doing in trying to determine it is, the best thing to do is to get a professional in and have him help you make that determination. The easiest way to determine what size you need, in my estimation, would be to take a projector, just a regular projector, take a cloth of some kind, a sheet or something, put your projector toward the back, and then just experiment with what sizes the average person could see without having to squint. That would be relatively easy to see all the way from the back. So there are people who do this for a living. My suggestion is that's money well spent, because after you spend your money on a projector and a screen that comes down, or a television of any size, a church, even the depth of our church is, we seat maybe 160 on a Sunday morning, so the depth of our church is probably about the depth of this room. And I don't think that we get away with any less than an 80-inch screen, which is going to start at about $3,000 at the cheapest. But it's best to have, in my opinion, unless you've got some good tech guys in your church, to have them work with you to figure that out. Because there are calculations the calculations have already been done for width, depth, height of ceiling, and all those things. That's all been done already.
God forbid that you ask them to move up from the pew they're sitting in to the front. Right.
I'm not doing this to split your church.
You're not going to be able to pay for the screen if you don't have their tie.
All right. Again, alternate types, fonts, and colors. Remember on this slide, I started with a serif font as the title. You don't have to do that. You could start with a sans serif font as a title. So if the title is sans serif, then use a serif font for the main points. Try to balance the font faces and sizes and so on. Now, another point that I have added here that was not on the previous one, actually this font in this room with this lighting, I would change the color of this font in this situation. Sitting in front of me where it is, it looks fine. In this room with this much glare, that color doesn't look right. So I would either need to darken the color of the font, or I would need to increase the drop shadow that's behind it to make it stand out. One of the things that you want to be very careful about is to use drop shadows very carefully. Some people feel like the stronger the drop shadow and the further the way it is from the font, the better things look. That's generally not the case. Let me see if I can give you an idea of what to do here. So I can increase the distance of the drop shadow a little bit, increase its blur a little bit, and decrease its transparency. And now it's a little bit easier to see, but it's actually probably just better to darken the font itself. There are multiple things you can do to solve those kinds of problems. My recommendation is that before you actually do a presentation, actually run through it yourself in church when you're by yourself and see what it looks like. And then have your wife critique it. As long as I keep churches together, that's my... All right. So here are some examples of the use of different kinds of fonts. In this case, I did apply a 3D effect to a font, but it was done sparingly, and it was done to make it look sort of gold. Again, this was done only in PowerPoint. All of this is all done in PowerPoint. This picture, I put a drop shadow on that was a gradient to give me a place to put the title. Otherwise, this just would have all been the same color green here. And Conquest and Settlement of the Promised Land, different font, and one that just fills out Joshua. So they come out together. Gospel of John, the light of the world. I added a little bit of a transparent shadow up there, and then across the bottom. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining these. These are just some examples of how to put different kinds of fonts together that work. That's actually a painting of the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans. It works pretty well for The Gospel Under Siege as a title for one of my series. And you see different, 3 different fonts being used. Now, one thing to think about is that fonts have what are called moods. Now, I know that may sound really fancy, but fonts have moods. In other words, what I mean by that is fonts feel a certain way. So, for example, let's say that you are going to be advertising a concert at your church. and you have this nice picture of the end of a violin. And so what do? You use a formal, elegant font as your main font, but you don't mix it with a handwriting font, right? Doesn't that kind of just go, ugh? So the moods of the fonts don't go together. So you want your, you can use something like this. It's actually what's called an oblique font. Oblique is a font that actually is tilted a little, which is different than an italic. Italic is when your font, italic is when you have a serif font that kind of has curves and stuff in it that looks kind of halfway towards handwriting. An oblique font is taking a font that normally stands straight up and down and just tilts it just a little bit. And so it's just a little bit different color. And actually what I did was, and this is something that it's again, something that you can learn how to do in PowerPoint, is to pick up a color. This color that I used here is not just out of anywhere. There's actually a paint dropper in PowerPoint. And I can say, what color do I want this? I grab the paint dropper and I picked up that color right there. Why? So that you have harmony of color. So you're using a color that's part of your picture. It's not absolutely necessary, but it's just a nice little touch to add, and it accomplishes what you're wanting to do. Here's another example of not mixing different moods. So here you have a wave, and your main title is Modern Simplicity. Using this old world font type just doesn't work as a subtitle, does it? Now, remember how I said yesterday, sometimes being lucky is better than being good? Sometimes you get really lucky, and I just happened to I decided on another font as my subtitle, and I got lucky. And here's what happens. If you happen to get luckier, then you are good. Why does this work as the subtitle font? Just think about it. I know now we're starting to get out into the la-la land of artistic world, right? But think about it for a second. Why does this work? It flows with the picture. Right, right. So you have these curvy things going on, just like the wave. It's curving over like the wave. You have the H. Little things like that really make the difference, especially if you're doing stuff for public consumption, which most of you hopefully are at your church or your book or your poster or your flyer, whatever you're doing, it's for public consumption. And remember this, you know, I'm not trying to put you under pressure, but you're up against people who are being paid millions of dollars to do this kinds of stuff, right? There's a reason why people get paid millions of dollars to do this kinds of stuff. And the problem, and the thing is, this is what the people in our church are exposed to. The stuff that is being done by people who are paid millions of dollars to do this kinds of stuff. And if you get even luckier, you may make a few million more. But those are the kinds of things, and what I frequently do, let me show you something that you can do in PowerPoint that is really a nice feature. Let's say you don't know what font to make this. So you drop down your font, your right here, your font thing, and you just start scrolling through it. See, I'm just using my cursor. And I just keep scrolling down. Definitely not using that. And if you're not feeling particularly creative that day, you just scroll down until you find something that you think that really works and that really doesn't. So again, sometimes being lucky is a good thing. But it is one of the nice things, features of PowerPoint, especially if you get these kinds of, if you get a lot of fonts on your computer. And obviously there was a time when computers were so limited in memory, the more fonts that you had, it really bogged your computer down. That's no longer an issue. Even on your slowest computers now, memory is not an issue. Fonts take memory. That is no longer an issue. So you can load it up with fonts. And the average font, if you're going to buy the average font, hold your breath, it's about $40. However, for every commercial font that you can buy, you can put the name of that font and free in front of it, and there will be somebody who's changed the font just enough that it is now outside of copyright protection. And I understand, I'm all for copyright, but just like everything else, there is the law, and that's why lawyers get paid what they get paid. And if they could make something off the copyright, it would be an issue. There are things that they change enough. You can imagine there are certain things you can't copyright. You just can't copyright them. For example, titles, book titles. You can have 100 books of exactly the same title. You can't copyright a book title. There are lots of things that can't be copyrighted. The way a curve goes on a particular letter can't be copyrighted. Everything about that font can be copyrighted when put together, but other things can't be. So you make use, you just be smart about how you do it. Not at all advocating going outside the law. Here's an example where even though the subtitle and the title, Gothic Century is the title, the subtitle is too similar. I would suggest that if you have subtitles that are too similar, that it's not as helpful. Don't mix similar typefaces any more than you mix font faces that are radically different in the mood. A couple of different options. Don't use something that's similar to the font, just use the same font in a smaller size. Okay? So there you have continuity. Nothing wrong with doing that. Or use a much different font. But using something close just kind of has a weird feel sometimes. You can use different weights within a font family. So Franklin Gothic is a whole range of fonts that contains dozens of fonts. Franklin Gothic family. So things come in families. So here you have Franklin Gothic Heavy combined with Franklin Gothic Medium. Works perfectly. Different color, different size, and you can use different weights in the same family. Here's another example, and I use this one all the time. This works, and they both work great for titles for slides and for the main points in slides. Americana, extra bold, and Americana BT. Different fonts, different weights in a family. Specialty fonts can be effective. You don't want to use them very often, but I put together a seminar called The Attack on Truth, and what did I do? I created, using a specialty font, I did something that made it look like graffiti on a brick wall. So I found a brick wall, I used the font, and then I just blurred the edge just a little bit and made it look like paint. Little tricks, took me 5 minutes to do, and they are tricks that you can actually, if you're thinking in those terms, you can come up with them fairly quickly. Here's another thing. I was teaching a course on world religions. Now, what did I do here with a specialty font, and why did I do it? So it's about Taoism, or Taoism. Well, it's obvious why I chose that font face, but why didn't I have it going across the top? Because you read Chinese top to bottom. So just a little trick. Just adds to what you're trying to accomplish. No big deal. I could have written it across the top, but I chose to do it this way. Did the same thing with the same course, world religions, Hinduism. There are fonts that look like Arabic. There are fonts that look like Hebrew. There are fonts that look like Sanskrit. There are fonts that look like Chinese, but they really aren't. So you use them to best effect. And you have to admit, that's a pretty cool picture. I wish I could take a credit for putting it together. I found it. See, again, getting lucky is sometimes better than here's an example of a Hebrew-looking font that I use in my course, God's Plan Through the Ages, the Davidic Covenant. There are a couple of Hebrew letters in there. Most of them aren't. But it works, right? The Davidic Covenant. Did the same thing for the Abrahamic Covenant. This is one case this is one case where I had really only 3 points I wanted to make, and I wanted in the student's mind for them to hang together. So in this instance, I did put more than obviously more than one idea on the slide. But I wanted them to hang together in the student's mind concerning 3 aspects of the Davidic Covenant. Now, I could have separated them. That's just a choice you're going to have to make, when to separate them, when to keep them together. If I had 15 points, they wouldn't all be on there, okay? These are teaching techniques that you need to be thinking through. There's one. Looks like Arabic, sort of. And it works in the course, or the seminar. Actually, the course I taught during the summer, Understanding Islam. All right, again, you can go for free fonts. Just go into your Google search and say free fonts, and what do you get? Lots and lots and lots of them. You can choose to pay for them at about $40 a pop. And depending on your usage, you're going to need to do that. But in most cases, you're protected by... The fact is, the people who are creating these that are similar to commercial fonts, they have to be careful or they're going to be out of business too. They stay in business by selling advertising on their websites, not by selling their fonts. Their fonts are free. All right, the next fun section. Choose color carefully. This is where you get your science lesson. Didn't know that was going to happen today, did you? Choose color carefully. Now, we actually are going to do a little bit of science lesson for those of you It's been a couple years since you were in high school and weren't paying attention in your physics class anyway. Okay, so you have a rainbow. How do rainbows work? Does anybody want to venture to be brave to tell us how and why rainbows work? Yes.
They split the color in the prism effect, giving the void you get red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo violet.
And actually almost an infinite number in between. Yes, yes. So what they're doing is they're taking sunlight, which through our atmosphere tends to look kind of yellowish, but actually sunlight, being nuclear fusion, is actually pure white light. And when it goes through droplets of water, each color is a different wavelength. And the water has, the density of the water causes every single frequency of color to shift just a little bit as it passes through it. And so what you're seeing when you're looking at a rainbow is the dispersion of pure white light through the prism of the water droplets. Or you can use a prism like this, which accomplishes the same thing. Now, there's some things about colors, though, that you probably haven't thought about. So, coming into a prism, you have pure white light. This piece of probably plexiglass has what's called a refraction index, which causes the light to bend at each frequency just at a little bit different rate. Now, notice these colors going from red, actually infrared in the invisible part here, to ultraviolet over here into the invisible side. And you notice that it's actually a spectrum. You say, why in the world? I did not come here to learn this. Well, actually, there is a reason for this. So, as you're moving one direction, you're going toward infrared. The other direction, you're going toward ultraviolet. But there's something interesting about the way these colors work in different situations. Notice this. Here, we have warm colors that we consider warm colors. Here, we have cool colors. Notice that they fall along this spectrum. Warm on this side, cool on this side. How and when you put those together have different effects on the overall feel of whatever you're putting together, whatever you're designing, the picture you're designing. I know you didn't realize that you were using science when you were putting your PowerPoint slide together, even if it had bullet points, but you were. Sorry, Steve, I couldn't help it. Okay. So we have primary colors. We call them primary colors that are red, blue, and yellow. You can't break light down or colors down any more than these three. Those are the basics. Then you have what are called secondary colors, and those are made by combining the adjacent primary colors. So combine red and yellow and you get orange, and so on. Then you have tertiary colors, which are combined by combining those in between. I'm not going to go any deeper than that. But you can imagine that actually it's a spectrum that is divided by actually single frequencies of colors, okay? So this is a color wheel that is going from light to dark along a particular color, all right? Now, why am I putting you through this? There really is a good reason for me to do this. You may not think there is, but trust me, there is. How many of you have ever made a brochure or something and you printed it out and it didn't look anything on paper like it did on your screen? Or you sent it off to a printer and it didn't come? There's a reason for that. There's a scientific reason for that. And here is what it is. Your television. Anybody have a television? Your television has 3 colors of LEDs in it. And they're really tiny and they're set really close together. And they're made up of yellow, magenta, and cyan. Those are the 3 colors on your TV. Tiny, tiny ones. And if you have a high definition television, you have a whole bunch of them. Now, when that color is projected at you, your brain tricks you. Because these colors are so close together that when your eyes I said yellow, magenta, and cyan. When your eyes see, they're actually red, blue, and green. When your eyes see blue and green turned on, they're actually seeing cyan. When red, green, and blue are turned on, your eyes see white. That's how your television works. That's not the way the printed page works. These are called additive color models. So you're adding all of these colors that are coming at you. What we're used to is this color model, the subtractive color model. So you have a printer that has, what colors does it have? Have you ever wondered why the colors in your printer are cyan and yellow and magenta and black? Well, when you put magenta and cyan together very close together on a piece of paper, it looks blue. The problem is that if you mix them all together, they look brown. So what do? Your printer has a 4th color, black, C-Y-M-K, cyan, yellow, magenta, and black. Now what they've done in recent years, and this is helpful, and the reason I'm telling you this is so that you don't get surprised, that you come up with this really nice looking brochure and it doesn't come out looking like it did on your screen. If you're printing at home and you're just printing on plain paper, you're going to end up with muddy looking colors that don't look like anything on your screen. But if you spend a little bit more money and buy photographic paper, that photographic paper is slick and it reflects the light more accurately so that you get almost photo quality off of your home printer. And the way they're doing this nowadays is that for every printer that's made, they have a color model. And they know exactly how each printer prints all of its colors. So that now when you send your brochure to a professional printer, it comes back looking the way it did on your screen in front of you. So we're in a much better situation than we used to be. But if you're wondering why when you print out on just regular 8.5 by 11 paper it doesn't look right, this is why. 2 totally different ways of handling light, whether it's being projected or being reflected. Far more than you ever wanted to know, right? But if you're doing anything for print work, Like I said, if you're doing stuff for book covers, posters, whatever you're doing, you at least need to be aware of this possibility. Okay? All right, let's see. Let's talk about, just in the last few minutes we had before the end of this break. Are there any questions about this, by the way? Are you all so confused that... So if you're in PowerPoint, you will find that your... let me just do this real quickly. So, here's what you normally see when you bring up your color, your quote-unquote color wheel on PowerPoint. It's this. But if you click on Custom, you actually see this. Now, in your computer, every color on the color wheel, on this color wheel, is defined in terms of a number, 0 to 255, or in other words, 256 colors. So you have 3 colors. We talked about 3 colors, these 3 colors on your computer screen. 3 colors, 256 times 256 times 256 is 16,777,216. Why that number? Because your eyes really can't distinguish any more than that many colors. So they just don't need to have, they don't need to be any better. Our computers, our screens are just as good as they need to be. Our eyes just cannot see any more than that in general. So everything that we need to see is made up of those colors. So that's the reasoning behind these 2 things that pop up here. This represents 16 million some odd colors. These are just the colors in between all those different colors. That is how color on your computer screen works. And this is where we will end for today.
And if you're writing a code for a computer and you take those numbers, you'll get that color on your, if you want to code something.
Yes. Actually, yes. Right. Yep. Okay, so we've got to 1 o'clock. We have a longer break. If you have specific questions, if you'd like for me to explain how to do something specific in PowerPoint, I'd be over something we've already talked about, because I may cover it tomorrow, but something we've already talked about, you have a specific question, how to accomplish something, let me know. I'll be glad to try to answer your question.